Oh boy, that G word. Well, hello there, and welcome to episode 11 of B.Hooked TV. I'm your host, Brittany. As always, it's such a pleasure to have you here today. And before we get to it, before we talk about that G word, gauge, go ahead and subscribe to the show if you haven't done so already. I make a new video every single week about topics like this that are geared to help you get better at crochet or knitting, and hopefully sometimes both. So subscribe to the show, and now let's get to talking about gauge. Gauge, simply put, is just a measure of stitches per inch and a measure of rows per inch. And the whole purpose for doing so is to bridge the gap between my unique style and your unique style, or another designer's style and your style. So that's why gauge is so important for you as a creator of a thing, as a follower of a pattern, because you want it to come out right? You want your project to come out the way it's supposed to, the way it's written in the pattern, the way it looks in the photos, and you have to make sure that your gauge matches the designer's in order for that to happen. Now, that's not to say that you have to change your crochet style or your knitting style to match mine, but you may have to adjust your tools so that your measure is the same. Are you seeing how all this comes together? Gauge is really a function of a unit. It's a way to bridge that gap between my style and your style so that we can create something that looks the same. Now, with that being said, there are 3 really important things that your gauge swatch will tell you as you progress to your project. The first thing is that it'll give you a peace of mind that your item, your project, whatever you're making, will come out the size that it's intended, or basically the size that's listed in the pattern. You're going off of that sizing information to, let's say, crochet or knit a sweater. You're going to invest a lot of time in that project, and you want to be darn sure it's going to fit you when you're done. The only way you can be sure of that and have that peace of mind is to know that your gauge matches the designer's, or you've done some type of work to obtain that same gauge. The other thing your swatch will tell you is whether or not you'll have enough yarn for the project. That's another thing, especially if you're ordering yarn online, the last thing you want to do is run out or play a game of yarn chicken and lose and not have enough yarn to finish your project. So when you're making your gauge swatch, you're matching your gauge, or you're matching the gauge of the designer, and in doing so, you are giving yourself that peace of mind that you have the right amount of yarn. Let's say you skip this process, you don't make a gauge swatch, you just wing it, and we'll take that same example. I crochet tighter than you do. You crochet more loose. When you crochet more loose, you use more yarn per stitch. So if you haven't done the work to match the gauge, there's a real chance that you're going to run out of yarn before you're through with the project. Now, it took me a little while to realize this. It seems so obvious now as I'm saying it, but also making a gauge swatch will let you know if you can do it. I always think it's a good idea to push yourself outside of your comfort zone when you're doing projects. That's how you'll get better and that's how you'll improve. But if you've taken it one step too far, you can figure that out in the early stages before you get knee-deep or waist-deep into a project and realize that maybe the stitch pattern isn't right for your skill set right now. If you make that gauge swatch, you only have a little bit of yarn and a little bit of time invested to figure that out. If it's a little bit too difficult, then maybe you just shelf that project for a little while and come back to it when your skills are up to par with that pattern. When you hear the term gauge swatch, this is what I'm talking about. Just a little square of stitches that's worked in your stitch pattern, that's using the hook size or the needle size that your pattern recommends, and of course the recommended yarn or the yarn you want to substitute with. We talked about that a little bit in the previous video, and it was a good one talking about yarn substitution. So if you haven't seen that one yet, you want to check that out. It's episode 10. The bottom line is we need to make one of these, especially for projects where sizing is important or when you think maybe you won't have enough yarn for the project, and always, always when you're trying to substitute yarn within a pattern. So always remember when you're making your gauge swatch to follow what's listed in your pattern and not what's on your yarn label. The stuff that's on the yarn label is somebody else's version of their gauge. It's what they got when they worked up however many stitches and however many rows with whatever needle or hook size. It's useful when you're trying to make yarn calculations on the fly, but it's not really useful when you're trying to determine whether or not this pattern is going to turn out the way it should, or if your gauge matches the designer's gauge. A good rule of thumb is to make a gauge swatch that's about 5 inches by 5 inches. And that's because it's really best to get a measure of gauge within 4 inches. So however many stitches is in 4 inches, how many rows is in 4 inches. That'll give you the best and most accurate results. So as a general rule of thumb, I tend to make my gauge swatches at least 5 inches by 5 inches. You now understand that gauge is a measure of stitches and rows per inch, and that the whole purpose of doing it, or understanding what it is to bridge the gap between my unique crochet and knit style and your unique crochet or knit style, or some other designers. Whoever's pattern you're following, gauge will be the peace of mind that you have to know that it comes out the proper size once you finished it, that you'll have enough yarn to finish it, and that you can even do it in general. It'll let you know that you have the skills at that particular time to work through that full pattern. I know gauge isn't always fun, but let's be honest, it's just got to be done. All right, that'll wrap it up for this week's episode of B.Hooked TV. Thank you so much for joining me again. It was a pleasure, as always. If you haven't done so already, please do subscribe to the show. My sole purpose is to help you get better at your craft, and by subscribing to the show, I can help you do that because I know you'll see each and every episode every single week. Now, if you have a topic that you would like to discuss, please leave that in the comments section. If there's something specific that you're struggling with as a crocheter or as a knitter, anything yarn related. So if you're struggling with something, just let me know, and you might see an episode on that in the near future. And lastly, if you got some real value in today's show, go ahead and hit that like button. That tells me that I'm on the right track and that this is a topic that's relevant for you. All right, now I will see you in next week's episode of B.Hooked TV. Bye for now.